If you have ever read the Bible, then you are likely familiar with the concept of the fallen angels, beings created of light, placed among the heavenly hosts, yet they fell, not because they were defeated, but because they chose to leave their station. But have you ever stopped, truly stopped, to ask, how could a being born of light, created in holiness, fall? And if one angel fell, why did hundreds follow? This was not an accident, not a slip. It was a pact of rebellion, a vow of defiance made among angels to unite with humans and give birth to a race never permitted to exist, the Nephilim. Genesis gives only a few lines. The Book of Enoch weaves it into a mysterious tale like an ancient dirge. But what is surprising, very few go on to ask the next question. If even angels, noble, exalted beings, can fall, then how could a human not? If the Watchers, appointed to guard the earth, could break the sacred covenant they once made with the heavenly host, how could a mere man like Noah, living in a generation soaked in corruption, remain undefiled? Noah was not the first to believe in God. He had no Torah, no stone tablets from Sinai, no temple for offerings, no righteous community to lift him up. He lived in a time when all moral systems had collapsed, all sacred foundations had crumbled, and every bloodline had been tainted by foreign, celestial beings. It was an era where people had forgotten the holy days, lost the ability to hear the divine call, and had become numb to the sacred. And yet, within that chaotic land, Noah was still called blameless, righteous in his generation. Not just poetic phrasing, it was a declaration of survival. What made that difference? What did he preserve that even the Watchers, those mighty angels, could not? It wasn't blind faith. It wasn't sheer willpower. Perhaps it was that he lived in tune with an ancient rhythm, a sacred frequency the world had forgotten. But he still remembered. And if he still remembered, then perhaps the covenant had never vanished. The traditional Bible calls Noah a righteous man in his generation, a title that echoes powerfully, a confirmation as though spoken directly from heaven. But then, pause a moment. Genesis offers no further detail. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't say what Noah learned, from whom, or how he managed to stay pure in a generation that had rotted to its roots. Was it simply a unique favor from God? Or was there something else, something erased from the picture, cut from the mainstream memory of faith? Among the ancient texts once present in the original faith of Israel, there was a book once passed down, then hidden away. The Book of Jubilees, also called the Book of Division or the Book of Sacred Cycles. A text not written by human inspiration, but revealed to Moses by an angel on Mount Sinai. At the same time, the commandments were carved onto the 2 stone tablets. Yet for reasons unknown, the tablets were preserved, while Jubilees was excluded from the official canon. Not because it was meaningless, but because it recalled something that had been forgotten, or forced to be forgotten. Unlike Genesis, Jubilees doesn't just retell, it rewrites the entire sacred history, according to 49-year cycles, dividing time into sacred festivals and declaring that the covenant, the Sabbath, the rituals of offering were observed since the time of Abel, passed down to Enoch, and through the generations of Seth, Methuselah, Lamech, to Noah. Noah, then, was not merely chosen. He was the last to remember how to live in rhythm. He knew how to offer sacrifices on the right day. He knew which animals were clean. He knew how to set up altars according to the divine cycle, not because he was naturally righteous, but because he had preserved the traditions of the patriarchs. While angels broke the covenant, while mankind mingled with hybrids, while bloodlines became chaotic, Noah, quietly, steadily, still lived as Abel once lived, and through him the covenant was restored. If this is true, if one man living in rhythm could sustain the divine current for all of humanity, then the question for us today is not, are you great, but rather, can you still hear that rhythm, or have you been out of sync for longer than you know? Because if the covenant still exists in silence, then as long as even one person remains faithful, it will never be extinguished. The question is, who will preserve it? When we think of the covenant, most of us immediately picture a mighty mountain, blazing fire, rising smoke, and thunder roaring over Sinai, where Moses came down with the 2 stone tablets engraved with the 10 Commandments. In the minds of the faithful, that is the starting point, the moment God officially entered into covenant with humankind. But if you believe the covenant began there, then perhaps you've arrived late, not by a few years, but by a few millennia. Because before there was Israel, before there was Egypt and the Exodus, even before there was Abraham, there were people who lived in harmony with God. They did not receive laws on tablets, but lived in a sacred rhythm carved directly into the soul. And the Book of Jubilees, a text removed from the official Bible, is the only one that still preserves that memory. Abel, the first to offer a sacrifice, did not act on whim. Jubilees says he offered the right kind on the right day. He knew which offerings were clean. He knew the appointed time for sacrifice, and he offered them in due season, as if there had already been a cycle in place, a rhythm he was simply continuing. Enoch, the man who did not die, was not just a mystical figure. According to Jubilees, he was the first to be taught how to record the sacred cycles, the lunar calendar, the weeks, the seasons of holy festivals. He was not only taken up to heaven, but carried with him the memory of divine order, which had been forgotten as mankind drifted further from the covenant. And Noah, long before the law, long before the temple, already knew how to discern clean animals. He knew how to build altars. He knew the appointed days for offering, not by instinct, but by patriarchal memory. He preserved the sacred frequency that the rest of the world had lost. The covenant, then, did not begin with law. It is not a legal code issued from on high. The covenant is resonance. It is the quiet cycle between heaven and earth. It is a rhythm of life, not forced, not formal, but whoever walks in step with it becomes by nature a keeper of the covenant. And perhaps the most terrifying thing is not breaking the law, but living out of rhythm. Because if the covenant is a sound, only those who still hear the original rhythm can harmonize. The righteous ones of old, like Abel, Enoch, Noah, did not live by command, but in order. No one commanded them, but they lived as though they had heard a sacred melody from the beginning. And if you too have ever heard that melody, then perhaps you've been in the covenant longer than you realize. We are often taught that Abraham lived by faith, as if he simply believed and followed a voice from heaven without knowing or keeping any kind of law. It's an inspiring image, a lone man in a foreign land daring to leave his father's house based on an invisible promise. But Jubilees tells a different story. It doesn't deny that faith, but deepens it. Because Abraham didn't just believe, he lived according to a divine order even before the law was given at Sinai. Jubilees clearly states, Abraham kept the Sabbath, a day established since the creation. He only ate clean animals, following the distinction preserved by Noah after the flood. He taught his children to separate the holy from the profane, to know the seasons of the festivals, and to offer sacrifices at the proper times. No one gave him laws, no Torah, no priests, no temple, but he lived as if remembering a divine system from the very beginning. The question is, where did he learn this? Jubilees answers, he learned it from the memory passed down by Shem, the son of Noah, who had preserved the sacred current from Eden. Shem was not just a blood ancestor, but a keeper of divine memory who passed it to Eber, then to Abraham. It was a silent flow, not bound by language or religious systems, but existing as an inner frequency, a law transmitted through life, through ritual, through living in season and in step. That is what set Abraham apart. Not only that he had faith, but that he lived within an order that the rest of the world had forgotten. In a world sinking into randomness and chaos, where nations built towers in pursuit of power, where rituals had become superstition and faith was replaced by control, Abraham quietly preserved a way of life that seemed to have been buried. And because he lived this way, he did not need written law to become a keeper of the covenant, not because he was perfect, but because within him the covenant came alive again, not as regulations, but as a rhythm in harmony with God. A man who did not wait for the law to be given, but lived as though the law was already inscribed upon his soul. This was not blind faith, but a watchful faithfulness, worthy of entering into covenant, and from that, a new people was born. You may have thought Eden was just the prologue, a first chapter quickly turned by sin and judgment. But if you read Jubilees, you'll see that Eden was not merely a place from which mankind was expelled. It was where the first covenant was sown into the soul of humanity. Eden was not just a garden, it was the first classroom, where Adam lived in unstained light for the first 7 years after his creation. In that time, he didn't just live, he was taught. Jubilees clearly states, in those 7 years, Adam was taught by angels about the sacred cycles, festivals, Sabbaths, seasons of offering, the order of months and years. Not so he could observe religion, but so he could live according to the calendar of heaven. It was a sacred calendar, not measured by agriculture, politics, or civil events. A calendar not governed by the sun, but by the resonance between earth and heaven. And from that moment, a divine rhythm began, silently passed down through generations. From Adam to Seth, from Seth to Enoch, then to Enoch, the one who recorded those cycles like heaven's own timekeeper, then to Noah, who, in the midst of chaos, still remembered the proper days for offerings, then to Shem, then to Abraham. A line of people who did not shout, did not write books, did not form religious sects. But they lived in the rhythm of the covenant naturally, as if it had been etched into their souls from Eden. Most of the world forgot. Most of humanity followed other calendars, the calendars of profit, of war, of power. But Jubilees whispers, if the covenant is a melody, then as long as one person keeps time, the song has never been lost. It still echoes, not on grand stages, but in quiet lives that know when to rest, when to worship, when to offer, not out of compulsion, but out of remembrance. a remembrance of something no one taught, but the soul once knew. You may not live in Eden, but if you have ever felt that something is off in the rhythm of your life, a vague sense of being out of sync without words to name it, then maybe you are hearing a faint echo from that garden. And if you still hear it, then that song is waiting for you to carry it forward in how you live each day. Most of what we know about the Watchers, the fallen angels, comes from romanticized images in books, films, and modern theological sermons. They are portrayed as emotional beings, seduced by human beauty, entangled in forbidden love stories, and falling like characters in a tragic, human-colored drama. That is how this world softens a truth too hard to face, that sometimes the gatekeepers become the violators. But Jubilees does not speak in emotional language. It does not call it love. It names it plainly: betrayal of the sacred covenant. According to Jubilees, the Watchers did not fall from weakness. They were not swept away by desire, but descended by choice, conspired together, made plans, and broke a sacred agreement that existed even before mankind was created. It was not the act of the fallen, but of the rebellious. They knew what was right. They understood the structure in place, but they chose to break it because they wanted a new order, a different structure where they ruled. And they did not strike with swords, but with knowledge. They gave mankind secrets not meant to be known: astronomy for divination, magic to manipulate outcomes, arts to stir lust, metallurgy to forge weapons of war. Things that seemed like advancement, but Jubilees warns this was forbidden knowledge because it did not elevate man. It fractured the soul's structure from within. The Watchers did not simply love the wrong people. They disrupted the sacred rhythm of the world. That rhythm had been established in Eden, where festivals, seasons of offering, and cycles of rest created a harmony between heaven and earth. But when the Watchers descended, bringing tools of distortion, they threw that rhythm off balance. They created a civilization with a warped structure, where time was sliced by political calendars, where beauty was defined by cosmetics, where knowledge did not lead to holiness, but to control. And if that's true, then the issue is not merely behavior. It's a deeper question. Who is rewriting the rhythm you're living by? If you find yourself rushed, consumed, ground down by schedules, then perhaps you are no longer living by heaven's calendar. Because when the covenant is broken, the sacred rhythm vanishes and man keeps walking, but no longer knows where he's going. In Genesis, the Nephilim are mentioned only briefly, called heroes of old, a vague title, without explanation, without elaboration. In Enoch, they appear more clearly: giant beings, half angel, half human, bloodthirsty, warring, devouring one another and humanity. But in Jubilees, the picture deepens. They are not just physical anomalies, but spiritual distortions. The Nephilim, in Jubilees' view, are dissonance to the very soul. They are not just the result of forbidden love. They are the outcome of a union never allowed between the light of angels and the dust of humans. Something that does not belong in the original order of creation. What is terrifying is not their height or strength, but the frequency they carry. They bear a kind of resonance that does not belong to this world, a core structure out of alignment with divine purpose. According to Jubilees, each child born from that bloodline was a sacred disruption, not just a distortion of human form, but of the soul. They grew unable to understand limits, unable to hear the divine call, numb to the sacred. They were a race that could not harmonize with the covenant, because they no longer had a point of connection with the original sacred rhythm. The presence of the Nephilim didn't just make the world violent, it made it chaotic on a deeper level. The divine order was broken. No one kept the seasons. No one made offerings in their appointed time. No one remembered the Sabbath. No one knew the festivals. Earth and heaven seemed out of orbit, not because of natural disaster, but because the bridge between realms had been scrambled. If you think this is just an ancient myth, look around. What was once sacred is now mocked. Time is no longer lived, but consumed. Beauty doesn't lead to holiness, but to lust. Knowledge doesn't bring understanding, but domination. These are the aftershocks of a hybrid order, one without root, without rhythm. Jubilees doesn't tell these stories to scare us. It tells them to help us remember. Because when the human soul starts to carry vibrations that don't belong to it, what is lost is not just morality, it is resonance with the divine. And when that is lost, we no longer know the way back. We often ask, why did God choose Noah? Why, among so many, was only one saved? But perhaps the deeper and more troubling question is, why was no one else able to be saved? Was God being selective, or had the fall reached such depth that no one could hear the covenant's call anymore? According to Jubilees, Noah was not extraordinary. The generation around him had simply lost all ability to resonate with heaven. In Jubilees' view, the collapse of that time was not merely moral, it was a dissonance at the soul's level. Humanity had lost its true lineage, not just genetically, but in inner frequency. The hybridization with the Watchers, through the Nephilim, had severed the sacred connection that kept mankind in tune with heaven's calendar. And when that order was broken, humanity lived like beasts, without seasons, without law, unable to tell the holy from the profane. They ate everything that moved. They offered sacrifices to false spirits and called them gods. They worshipped on impulse, lived each day as if there were no tomorrow, as if no one remembered any cycle at all. No more sacred festivals, no more holy days. No sign that any memory of Eden still remained. Jubilees shows the real despair was not in violence, but in the complete loss of connection with the first melody. And when no one lives in rhythm, the covenant has nowhere to dwell. Like a song where every instrument is out of tune until the original melody is unrecognizable. In that setting, Noah was not a moral genius. He was simply the last one who remembered the song. He lived in season. He offered in time. He discerned the clean, not because he was taught, but because he remembered the traditions of the patriarchs. He was not above others, but he still carried the harmony. And that is why he was chosen, not because he was perfect, but because he still had the capacity to resonate with the covenant. His generation, though numerous, powerful, advanced, had strayed too far from the sacred frequency. No one had rhythm. No one listened anymore. Only Noah, like the last note still in tune. And if you understand that, perhaps you'll begin to listen again. Does your soul still carry any melody, or has it too been drowned out by the noise of this age? We often call Noah a righteous man, as if it were a moral title, that he was better, more ethical, less sinful. But if you read only the canonical Bible, you won't see why he was called that. Jubilees tells it clearly. He kept the law. Not the law carved on Sinai's stones, but the sacred law passed down quietly from the patriarchs, a rhythm of life the rest of the world had forgotten. Noah knew which day was holy, not because he was commanded, but because he still heard the rhythm. He knew which animals were clean, not from law books, but from a tradition guarded since Adam, through Seth, through Enoch, through Shem. He knew how to build altars, how to select offerings of the right kind, on the right day, in the right season. Not on a whim, not when he felt inspired, but according to a cycle established between heaven and earth, since Eden. Noah did not live by instinct, nor did he live out of fear of judgment. He lived attuned to the frequency of his ancestors, steadily, without missing a beat. While others rushed, he kept a slow rhythm. While people ate indiscriminately, he maintained the standards of purity. While society forgot the appointed days, he offered sacrifices in season. No one pressured him. No one praised him. But he lived like one who remembered what the whole world had forgotten. And that was what allowed him to walk with God. Not because he accomplished something great, but because he walked in steady cadence in a world that had fallen out of sync. He didn't argue, he didn't resist, he didn't debate. He simply lived on rhythm, like a musician keeping time in an orchestra that had lost its harmony. Imagine a choir off-key, every voice in disarray. Yet amidst the chaos, one person keeps the right tempo, the right pitch. That person makes no noise, draws no attention, but if the song were to be rewritten, it would begin from them. Noah was that person. In a generation loud with the cries of lust, power, and forbidden knowledge, Noah lived as one who still remembered the sacred song, though no one else was singing. And if the covenant is a melody, then he was the last note still in tune. That didn't make him perfect, but it made him worthy for the story to begin again with him. And perhaps that is what righteousness truly means. Genesis leaves many questions. It says Noah was righteous, that he was chosen, that he built an ark, and that he survived. But it doesn't say why. It doesn't explain. How did Noah know to offer sacrifices? Who taught him how to choose clean animals? How did he know how to build an altar? And why was his first act upon leaving the ark not building shelter or seeking food, but making an offering? The Book of Enoch hints at mystery, but only Jubilees dares to name the heart of it. A sacred order broken by angels and silently preserved by a man. Without Jubilees, we might think Noah was simply a special case, a good man among the wicked. But when reading Jubilees, we realize he wasn't chosen by accident. He was the final point in a divine line, a living stream of the covenant flowing from Abel to Seth, to Enoch, to Methuselah, to Lamech, and then to him. Each person in that line held a fragment of memory, of heaven's calendar, of sacred days, of properly timed rituals. And Noah, through perseverance, preserved the whole. Jubilees says Noah was taught by angels, that he knew which offerings belonged to which season, that he understood the difference between the clean and the unclean, not just in food, but in spiritual frequency. And because of this, he built an altar the moment his feet touched dry ground, not as a gesture of gratitude, but because he knew that day was a covenant day, a moment already marked in the divine cycle, and he would not miss the rhythm. No other book tells this, not because they didn't know, but because the world chose to forget. When Jubilees was removed from the official canon, we lost a map, not just of time, but of soul's frequency. And from then on, we began to believe that being chosen was a miracle requiring no preparation. But Jubilees says otherwise. Being chosen is the fruit of a silent chain of faithfulness, passed on without words, lived out in sacred rhythm, until only one person remained to carry it. And that person was Noah. Not a superhero, not a prophet, but a man who still heard the first melody. And because of one such man, the covenant continued. Without Jubilees, this might have been forgotten. But because it still exists, the melody has not gone silent. The only question is, are you still quiet enough to hear it? After the flood had passed, after the cries of humanity had faded beneath the waters, when the earth was still cold and muddy, strewn with debris and remnants of a lost generation, Noah stepped out of the ark. He did not rush to build a tent. He did not hunt for food. He did not count livestock, grain, or firewood. The very first thing he did was build an altar. It was not an emotional reaction, not a "thank God I'm alive" moment, not the act of someone shaken, clinging to faith after horror. It was a ritual, performed in season, with the proper animals in the proper way, as though he knew precisely that day was a marked moment in heaven's calendar. It was a sacred rhythm, not begun with him, but quietly preserved since the time of Abel, of Enoch, passed down as a sacred inheritance. Genesis simply notes that Noah built an altar, but it doesn't say why. It doesn't say where he got the clean animals. It doesn't say how he knew what to do. But Jubilees makes it clear. Noah offered his sacrifice on the covenant day, a day forgotten by all, but remembered by him. He selected the proper animals, the ones he had kept separate even before entering the ark. Not because he preferred them, but because he knew they were necessary to continue the covenant after the judgment. Noah did not invent the ritual. He did not create anything new. He remembered, and he kept it. In a world that had forgotten the entire sacred cycle, where ritual had become superstition, where worship turned to violence, where holy days were indistinguishable from the profane, Noah kept the rhythm. And that's why his first act was not for survival, but for restoring order between earth and heaven. It was the act of a priest, without robes, without a temple, just a stone altar, a soul in rhythm, and a memory unerased. In the moment when humanity had just been cleansed, Noah did not rebuild civilization. He re-established the covenant, and that is what made the heavens stand still. Not that he survived, but that he remembered the covenant day must be honored. If you've ever asked, what made Noah special? Perhaps this is the answer. Not strength, not brilliance, but a quiet continuity in a chaotic age. A man who laid the first stone, not to build a house, but to rebuild the connection between man and the divine. And when that sacred rhythm struck again, everything could begin anew. The question is, how did Noah know what to offer, when, and how? There were no liturgical books, no temple, no priesthood. Yet he knew. Not only knew, but performed it in its season, with the right animal, in the right way, on the right day. This could not come from instinct. It came from a sacred tradition, preserved and passed down by those who never fell. According to Jubilees, it was the angels, those who remained faithful to God, who taught Noah. Not the watchers who fell, but the ones who stood firm in the covenant. They taught him to distinguish clean animals, not for health reasons, but as a sacred language for restoring divine order. They didn't teach him to know, but to enact the ritual on the exact day the covenant would be renewed. And Noah remembered. Not only remembered, but stepped into that rhythm without missing a day. Jubilees records a stunning detail. Noah's offering after the flood took place on the exact covenant day that had already been appointed in heaven's calendar. Not early, not late, not out of feeling, but on a set time determined in the sacred cycle long before the ark was ever built. Nothing about Noah was random. Every act was a fulfillment of remembrance. The altar he built was not invention, but restoration. The animals he selected, not practical, but those ordained since Abel's time. And the day he offered was not arbitrary, but one of the covenant days preserved only in the sacred calendar of Jubilees. Picture it. The world has just been washed clean. No one remains. No system of worship, no priesthood, no holy nation, no Israel, no Moses, just one man, and a ritual passed down in silence by heavenly beings, like a flame that never went out in the darkness. And Noah, in the midst of ruin, stepped into the rhythm, not one beat off, not a moment too late. That is why he was called righteous, not because he was more moral than others, but because he lived on the appointed day, performed the prescribed rite, and restored a covenant that had once been established before the world lost its rhythm. And had he been a day late, or forgotten the rite, the flow of the covenant may have been severed completely. But he did not forget, and because of that, the covenant was not lost. This story, ultimately, is not just about a man. It is the story of a rhythm of life. The covenant was not rewritten by thunderous voice from heaven. No lightning, no fire pillars, no trembling mountains. The covenant was rewritten by one small act, at the right time, in the right season, in the right way. Not etched in stone tablets, but etched into Noah's very way of life. When he offered his sacrifice, the world was still covered in mud and ash. No worship system had been rebuilt, no faith community had gathered. But it was in that moment that a sacred order began to awaken, not by miracle, but by a rhythm preserved. A rhythm thought to be lost, erased by violence, distortion, and the fall of angels and men who forgot why they were made. Noah kept the rhythm, and just one man doing so was enough for the covenant to endure. It was not just a memory, it was the remaining breath of a sacred cycle, a rhythm from which a new lineage could begin. Not because Noah was great, but because he could still hear the original melody, and he struck one true note in the midst of ruin. And perhaps, as with all sacred melodies, one true note is enough for the song to go on. We may have thought the covenant was broken, that after Eden, after Cain, after generations buried in chaos, all things sacred had been forgotten. That in the wars, the multiplying sins, the covenant had been torn to shreds, leaving no trace. But Jubilees whispers something different, not loudly, not forcefully, just quietly says, the covenant was never lost. Mankind simply forgot where it was. And it was in the darkest moment, when no one on earth could still keep the sacred frequency, that Noah still remembered. He didn't just survive, he remembered. He didn't just save himself and his family, he preserved a rhythm thought lost since Eden. And because of him, the covenant echoed again, like an ancient bell ringing through the first footsteps in the garden, through Abel's sacrifice, through the quiet life of Enoch, and then, kept alive, held on to, awaiting another generation who would remember. Maybe that generation is us, and the only question that remains is not whether the covenant still exists, but whether anyone is still quiet enough to hear its melody and step into the rhythm that never truly ceased. The Book of Enoch says the watchers saw the daughters of men were beautiful and were drawn to them. The story feels familiar, like a tragedy. Love crossing the boundaries of heaven and earth. A tale of those who fell for love, for emotion, for weakness. It is easy to sympathize, easy to romanticize, but Jubilees does not accept that telling. It does not soften the blow. It does not blur the truth. It calls it by its real name, a deliberate betrayal, with the goal of breaking the sacred covenant that existed before mankind. In Jubilees, the watchers did not fall by accident, nor were they seduced by weakness. They made a vow atop Mount Hermon, together in a pact. They did not love, they plotted. They were not tempted, they chose rebellion. They descended not to understand humanity, but to seize the place of the Creator. They brought with them forbidden knowledge, enchantments, manipulation, warfare, cosmetics, divination, alchemy. They redesigned mankind in their own image, starting with hybrid offspring and then reshaping society through magic and domination. What they betrayed was not just a command. They broke the very structure of the sacred universe. The covenant, according to Jubilees, was not merely a spoken contract. It was a rhythm of life, a cycle, a current established with the first light of creation. And when the watchers descended, they did not just step out of heaven, they severed the flow of the creative order itself. If you've seen their fall as a sad tale of loving the wrong person, wake up. For Jubilees reveals it as a calculated rebellion, an orchestrated attempt to dismantle the covenant at its core, and that cannot be undone with apology. It created a rift that has never been fully healed, one that required the intervention of heaven itself. Genesis calls them heroes of old, mysterious figures living on in ancient memory. The Book of Enoch describes them as giants, towering, brutal, and bloodthirsty. But Jubilees doesn't stop at height or strength. It points directly to their essence. The Nephilim were not merely monsters. They were a distortion of being itself, a life form that did not belong to any sacred order. They were not just hybrids of angel and man. They were the product of a forbidden fusion between light that had rebelled and flesh that had already fallen. Not life, but a mutation of the soul. They had bodies, but no sacred root. Their spirits could not connect with the divine. They belonged to no cycle of ritual. They could not live in heaven's rhythm. They could not harmonize with the covenant. They could not remember, and they could not repent, and so they could not be redeemed, could not be sanctified, could not return. They lived in absolute dissonance, a field of spiritual interference, where divine will could not pass through. They were not just terrifying creatures, they were fractures in the structure of salvation. They did not only destroy with swords, they shattered the framework of the covenant by their very existence. Jubilees describes the Nephilim not as powerful beings, but as parasites on the world, corrupting bloodlines, distorting order, and sowing chaos beyond repair. They could not belong to any rhythm because they were not born of the sacred melody. And so they were excluded from all covenants, from earth to heaven. No path back, no common language with beings who still held the original frequency. This is what made the Nephilim so dreadful, not merely their strength, but the fact that they embodied a world beyond redemption. Jubilees doesn't just say that Noah's generation was sinful. It says they were completely misaligned in the structure of life. No one could distinguish holy days from ordinary ones. No one remembered the seasons of the covenant. No one upheld the purity laws. No one lived in the sacred cycles once taught to Adam, upheld by Abel, and recorded by Enoch. People married, ate, built, and killed, not by season, not by festival, not by any divine rhythm. That world was not just immoral, it was rhythmless. Human language no longer harmonized with heaven. Rituals were either corrupted or erased. Eyes could no longer see the sacred. Ears could no longer hear the heavenly call. And hearts no longer trembled before the holy. Not because they didn't believe, but because they had lived off rhythm for so long, they lost the ability to resonate with the divine. And in such a world, death did not come as punishment. It came as a clearing of the stage. There was no choice left but the flood, not because God was angry, but because the covenant had nowhere to dwell. No one remained pure enough to offer sacrifices. No soul remained in sync to hear the original rhythm. No one held the sacred frequency. And so, the covenant was not broken, it fell silent. Only Noah remained as the final note in the cosmic symphony. And to keep that note from vanishing, everything else had to stop. Not from vengeance, but because restarting was the only path left. Genesis calls Noah a righteous man, but gives no explanation. It leaves a gap, as though his righteousness were a miracle in the dark. But Jubilees goes deeper. It doesn't mythologize Noah, it shows that he wasn't chosen for morality, but for rhythm. Noah could distinguish clean animals, not by instinct, but through ancient knowledge. He knew how to build altars, not to seek luck, but to fulfill ritual on schedule. He knew the days for sacrifice, not by emotion, but by a sacred calendar passed down. No one gave him law, no one reminded him. He lived within a quiet, sacred tradition, from Adam to Seth, to Enoch, to Methuselah, a lineage that kept rhythm without words. In a dissonant world where everyone lived by impulse and desire, Noah still walked in the original cycle, though no one else walked with him. He was not better in the modern moral sense. He did not win by being more virtuous. He was simply the last person still in step with a song being played all wrong. And because of that, he could reconnect with the covenant, not by virtue, but by spiritual alignment. He was a bearer of memory, not of concepts, but of rhythm, not because he was flawless, but because he had not lost the original melody. And that, through the last resounding beat, saved the world from being erased. When the ark stopped, when the earth was still damp, when life had not yet sprouted again, and the world lay in mud, stones, and unspoken memories, Noah stepped out. He did not build a home. He did not search for food. He did not rush to pitch a tent. His first act was to build an altar. No one commanded him. No voice from heaven called. No angel appeared with instructions. No one watched to applaud. But Noah knew this was the moment of covenant, not from feeling, but from memory. He knew he stood at the exact point when the celestial time and earth aligned once again. And so he did what the patriarchs once did, just as Abel had offered, just as Enoch had recorded, the right clean animals, the right number, the right wood, the right fire, the right laying on of hands. Every detail followed a silent tradition, a chain of sacred memory in which he was the last link. No tablets, no law, no trumpet, no congregation, only smoke rising from an altar in the ruins. And from that smoke, the covenant lived again, not through grand declarations, not through paper covenants, but through a rhythm restored, in silence, in solitude, in a world not yet reborn. But within that quiet, a great faithfulness echoed. The covenant does not require crowds, nor a throne, nor a temple, just one person living on rhythm. And when Noah lit the fire, placed the offering, and let the smoke rise like a sigh from the depths of creation, heaven held its breath, earth waited, and the covenant rose from the ashes, again in silence, but echoing through generations. We often think that to sustain the covenant requires a whole people guarding it, a majestic temple, a solid ritual system, a community united under a sacred calendar. But Jubilees whispers a different truth. The covenant does not need the multitude, it only needs one who keeps the rhythm. Noah is the proof. He was not a prophet. He did not shout God's name in public squares. He did not preach, did not found sects. He simply lived in season, offered on time, built altars on schedule, kept clean animals, exactly as passed down from Abel, from Enoch, from the patriarchs of Shem's line. No one walked with him. No one reminded him of the calendar. But he missed no season, skipped no holy day, drifted from no cycle. In a shattered world, he alone still heard the sacred melody and lived by it like a reflex deep in the soul. And that, neither outward virtue nor theoretical ethics, was what moved heaven. Heaven does not wait for crowds. Heaven waits for one who keeps the beat. And when Noah offered, no thunder, no voice was needed, just smoke on the right day, with the right animal, in the right season. And the covenant rose again. You may not be great. You may have no manual to teach you how to do this. But if you still hear something, a beat from Eden, a stirring in your heart in a sacred season, perhaps you too are chosen, not to succeed, but to keep the rhythm, not to reform the world, but to preserve a soul melody the world has forgotten. Because as long as one remembers, the covenant has never been lost. For thousands of years, many have tried to redefine the covenant through theology, legal systems, institutional religion. Books were written, debates held, denominations formed, all in the hope of explaining the covenant in the most accurate way. But Jubilees does not do this. It does not define. It does not argue. It simply tells of how the righteous lived quietly, steadily, yet in season, in time, in rhythm. Noah is one example. He did not debate doctrine. He made no ontological declarations. He simply built an altar on the covenant day, offered clean animals, distinguished sacred seasons from ordinary days. And somehow that silent way of living was enough to awaken the forgotten sacred calendar. No definition ever could. The essence of the covenant is not in words. It is not theory, nor does it need to be defended by argument. It is a rhythm, and only when lived in rhythm does it truly exist. The covenant does not need redefinition. It only needs reliving, and anyone, if they still hear that frequency in their soul, can become a place where the covenant lives again. No applause, no office, just a life lived in time as an act of quiet, steady faith. We often believe that only when the majority awakens the world will change, that there must be movements, temples, thousands praying in unison to bring restoration. But Jubilees tells a different story, quieter but deeper. The covenant is not sustained by crowds, but by one person. When Noah stepped off the ark, he waited for no one, needed no confirmation. He built an altar. He offered on the exact day, not early, not late, not from emotion, not from fear, but because he lived in rhythm, the same rhythm kept by his forefathers. In that unobserved act, the sacred calendar was reconnected, the forgotten cycle revived. Divine order began to return from one man, one day, one offering. Noah did not represent mankind, he represented faithfulness, not to make noise, but to keep the fire, not to preach, but to stay on time. And that was enough for the whole universe to pause, listen, and restart on the old rhythm. We may be waiting for a great revival, but Jubilees whispers, one person in rhythm, and the covenant has never been lost. One soul still hearing the sacred beat, and the calendar begins to turn again. Maybe not from a great leader, but from you. You don't need to be a prophet. You don't need to build an ark in the desert. You don't need to raise an altar in a ruined world. You don't even need to offer sacrifices or be holy in the way the world defines it. But if 1 week you pause on Sabbath, not out of duty, but because a beat from Eden still echoes in your heart, then you are holding a piece of Eden. If you can still tell the sacred from the common, if you still step back from the rush to hear a whisper in your soul, then you are not alone. You are keeping the rhythm of the covenant. And if you keep it, even in silence, your children will see. Those near you will feel it. A new cycle, needing no inauguration, will quietly begin. No announcement, no ordination, no structure required. Just you, living in rhythm, and the covenant will resound again, like an ancient melody waiting for someone to softly hum it once more. Maybe you won't speak, but your faithfulness will speak for you. And sometimes that is enough to change a whole generation. We often think being chosen means being great, a prophet, a teacher, an influencer. But Jubilees tells another story of someone who lived quietly yet kept the original melody in a chaotic world. Noah did not gather crowds, did not build temples, did not launch movements. He simply lived in rhythm, in season, in ritual, just as his ancestors had. And that made him the chosen one. Not to be a hero, but to keep the fire when no one else would. Because the covenant doesn't need the masses. It needs one who still hears the sacred rhythm. One who knows when to pause, when to remember, when to slow down and live in appointed time. And if your heart still hears a beat, an urge to live deeper, truer, more aligned, then maybe you have been called, not to teach, not to prove, but to preserve. So the covenant is not forgotten, even in just one person. Today's world is not so different from Noah's. We live in rush, in clamor, in overlapping voices, full schedules, and holy seasons stripped of their sacredness. Holy and ordinary blur. Rituals are trimmed down. No one remembers which cycles are heaven's and which are man's. Sacred signals are lost in the noise of modern momentum. But Jubilees doesn't leave us hopeless. In that very chaos it whispers, the covenant doesn't need an army to rise again. It only needs one who is still in rhythm, one who still stops on holy days, still keeps their heart quiet to hear what lies beyond words, still knows that not everything is measured by productivity or time. If you are that person, if you have kept the rhythm, then you are not only saving yourself, you are holding a piece of heaven's calendar in the modern world. And sometimes one person offering in season, walking in cycle, can revive a forgotten flow, quietly but firmly, just as Noah once did. You may have read this long reflection about the Watchers, the Nephilim, Noah, and a covenant once forgotten and preserved. But if all you carry away is information, then the story has not truly begun, because the covenant does not live in books, not in texts, not among the letters. It lives in the way you choose to live each day, in one silent decision no one sees, to rest on time though no one around you rests, to forgive in season though your heart still aches, to keep what's right though the world has chosen wrong. The covenant is a rhythm, not a doctrine, and if you live in that rhythm, you are letting the covenant flow again. You don't need to change the world, you only need to stay in rhythm, because in a fractured world, one person keeping time is enough for the ancient melody to sound again. And if you still hear it, don't ignore it. Maybe you are not just a reader, you are a keeper, and the covenant, right now, is waiting to live again in the way you take your next step today. Amen.